I'm John Little for Megashock.com, and this is the Weekend Shockcast for March 1st and 2nd of 2014. What a difference a week makes. Last weekend we were finishing up the Winter Olympics and staging a coup in Kiev. This weekend we contemplate consequences in Crimea and World War III as Russia rushes troops into Sevastopol and Simferopol and talks about their nuclear capabilities. I shudder to think what next weekend will bring. All of this is courtesy of our friends in the U.S. State Department, the CIA, and a host of alphabet agencies in Europe. We've driven right past the turnoff to sanity and chosen to head straight over the cliff into the abyss. Is there anyone out there who understands how truly evil all this is? Of course you get it, otherwise you wouldn't be reading this or listening. But what is it going to take for our family, friends, and neighbors to wake up and realize that we are in a truly desperate situation? I would dearly love to know that one, I really would. But let's get to the articles I wrote this week. On Monday I wrote, Ukraine cannot escape Russia, the Carpathians. Yay! No terrorism at the Sochi Olympics. We can breathe a sigh of relief. Everything is wonderful. The sun is shining. The birds are singing. The world is... Wait. We're at war with Russia in Kiev? Yeah, U.S.-backed protest groups have taken over the capital of Ukraine and deposed the president, dividing the country into the pro-EU West and pro-Russia East. And Putin cannot allow this to happen. And the biggest reason has everything to do with mountains, the Carpathian Mountains. Have you ever wondered why Switzerland has never been conquered? Do you know why the U.S. has been so reluctant to invade Iran? Mountains. Mountains have been one of the most effective barriers to invasion in all of history, and Russia suffers from an extreme lack of them. In fact, Russia is flat, very, very flat, and the Mongols use that flatness to dominate Russia. Take a good hard look at Russia's borders. Do you notice what is at the edge of those borders? Mountains, water, or strongly allied, i.e. subjugated, countries with mountains and water. However, there are two exceptions, Finland and Europe. Finland is a lovely country, but they haven't been a military threat for a long, long time, although they did help Hitler in 1941. The same cannot be said about Europe. When Napoleon invaded Russia, he did it through Poland. When Hitler invaded Russia, he did it through Poland. Why? Because of the Carpathian Mountains. The Carpathians extend from Poland to almost the Black Sea and make it virtually impossible to invade Russia from Europe without going through Poland. That is, if you're coming from the European side of the Carpathians. But what if Ukraine joins Europe, which they seem to want to do? Well, since Ukraine is on the Russian side of the Carpathians, those mountains would no longer be a barrier to invasion and would double Russia's vulnerability. Russia would need twice the army to guard that border, and Russia cannot afford to support an army of that size. That is why Russia cannot allow Ukraine to fall into the hands of the European Union. So expect Russia to quietly and firmly up the pressure. If Putin can take back Ukraine by covert means, he'll do that. If the US and EU block covert action, Putin will send in troops. Whatever happens, one thing is completely certain. Russia will get Ukraine back, no matter what the cost. Now, how much will the US and EU make Russia pay to get Ukraine back? I'm not sure that we want to know the answer to that question. Are you ready for this? On Tuesday, I wrote an evil smell from Kiev. As I sit here thinking about who is doing what and why, I am struck by a sense of evil. I've been watching the U.S. State Department for decades, and they are some of the most evil psychopaths on the planet. These people are completely without any conscience whatsoever, and I've seen their work firsthand. They care about no one and nothing but themselves, their careers, and if anything is left over, maybe their country. They certainly care about no other nation or people. The State Department has done everything from sacrificing millions of Jews to betraying the Green Movement in Iran. They sought to destroy Israel in 1973 and threw Eastern Europe to the Soviets at the end of World War II. There is nothing and no one that they will not betray. So what are they doing in Kiev? So what are these people of uncertain parentage up to? Ukraine, pronounced Ukraina by Ukrainians, offers very little in the way of legitimate strategic importance to either the U.S. or Europe. Ukraine wouldn't add much to the strategic depth to Europe if Russia ever tried to invade, because Ukraine sits on the other side of the Carpathian Mountains. The Carpathians offer a much better defense to Russia than Ukraine ever will. But I mentioned that word legitimate. On the surface, the only real reason why Europe and the U.S. would want control of Ukraine is because that country is the perfect launch pad for a ground war against Russia. And that is not legitimate. Furthermore, Vladimir Putin definitely understands that bringing Kiev under the umbrella of the EU makes Russia far, far weaker, and Russia's history makes that unacceptable. Please remember that the history of Russia is about invasion of one kind or another. The Mongols murdered and raped their way back and forth across Russia for hundreds of years. Then the most vicious of the Mongol tax collectors rose up and threw out the horde and became the Tsars. Napoleon invaded and captured Moscow in 1812 before having to retreat. They were conquered by revolution and communism in 1917. They were invaded by Hitler in 1941 and defeated in the Cold War by the U.S. and Europe in 1992. And let's not forget the weather. And you think that Russia is going to sit by while her enemies set up a jumping-off point for another invasion? No, I don't think so. And Putin doesn't think so either. Now, the U.S. State Department knows all this. They might be psychopaths, but they aren't stupid, so you have to ask yourself, what are they up to? The only thing that I can think of is that they are getting ready to take us to war, which is the classic choice when a country runs into financial difficulties, and we have never, ever in the history of humanity faced such financial difficulty. We are staring into the financial abyss, and the psychopaths in the U.S. government and Europe are getting ready to murder millions, even billions of people to avoid falling into that abyss. Welcome to the New World Order. Please enjoy your stay. Are you ready for this? On Wednesday, I wrote, Why Putin Must Act, the Siloviki. There is so much evil going on in the United States right now that it seems somehow irresponsible to keep turning our attention to Ukraine. Seriously, my blood boils at the children ripped from the arms of parents by an evil government, and I rage at the police that are abusing the average citizen in every town and city across the country. So with all the evil going on, why keep pointing at Ukraine? Well, it might surprise you to hear me say this, but I'm not completely sure why Ukraine is so important. Yes, I know that Ukraine sits at a strategically important location, but there's something else going on. The United States and Europe have been goading the Russians, and I am beginning to wonder what the Russians will do to get them to stop. There's an evil smell coming from the activities of the U.S. and the EU. They are clearly up to no good, but we'll set that aside for the moment. Let's talk about Putin. When Putin came to power, he set up two centers of influence within the Russian government, the Siloviki and the Civiliki. The Siloviki were the politicians and bureaucrats with strong military or intelligence backgrounds. The Civiliki were the economists, sociologists, and career bureaucrats without KGB links, but with connections to Putin going back to his days in St. Petersburg in the 90s. These two groups were to compete with each other for the betterment of Russia and Putin. But that didn't work out quite as well as planned, because the Civiliki dropped the ball and made a mess of things. With the decline of the dovish side, the Civiliki of the Kremlin, the Hawks, or Siloviki, rose to prominence. Not a good thing. Do separate searches for Siloviki and Civiliki. You'll find that the Civiliki articles are older and far less numerous than the Siloviki articles. And the Civiliki don't even have a Wikipedia page. I know that this is hardly a scientific analysis, but it should tell you something about Russia's direction and Putin's options. With the Siloviki looking over Putin's shoulder, a softly approach isn't going to go over well. If Putin appears to sit this fight out, the Russian generals are going to get restive and whisper about Vladimir's lack of resolve. Putin cannot allow that if he wants to stay in power. That's why he needs to produce results quickly. Of course, we're assuming that Putin isn't one of the Siloviki himself. Remember that he was a lieutenant colonel in the KGB until he chose to retire and enter politics in 1991. No one reaches that rank in the Komitet Gosudarstvenoi Bezopasnosti, or KGB, without being very politically aggressive. And let's not forget the Ukrainian city of Sevastopol. Sevastopol is the home of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Losing that base will make Russian naval operations in the Mediterranean far more difficult at a time when Russian interests in the Mediterranean are under threat. This is not a good time for that. But this base is located in a place called Crimea. Crimea is very pro-Russia and very independent-minded. In fact, Crimea's official designation is the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, and it's the only autonomous republic in Ukraine. So what do you think is going to happen when the US and the EU try to drag Ukraine away from Russia's influence? Russia will tighten her grip and pull from the other direction, and Russia's grip will be wrapped around the very strategic Crimea. Unfortunately, it will tear Ukraine in two. Just take a look at the two maps that I've included in my article. If you look at them, you'll see that there's a place that's 77% native Russian speaking. That's Crimea. Can you see where Ukraine will split in two? Do we know where this will end? Do we even know why the US and the EU are provoking a conflict with Russia right now? And of course, the next question is, are you ready for this? On Thursday, I wrote Ukrainian Genocide, Coming to America. I've been talking about a number of things in this accidental series on Ukraine. I talked about Rosh on Friday and the importance of Ukraine to the alliance of Gog and Magog in Ezekiel 38 and 39. On Monday it was mountains, Carpathian Mountains, and why they are so important to the Russians, and why they are the reason why Russia cannot allow Ukraine to break free. But there's a distinctive and evil smell of U.S. and European meddling in the events of the past few weeks and months, and I wrote about that on Tuesday. Yesterday I talked about Putin's need to act and how that action will tear Ukraine in two. There's a reason why Ukraine threatens to split in two, and it's called the Holodomor. And there's something deeply and terribly personal about this Holodomor that you need to think about. Oh, and why do I call this an accidental series? Because I never really expected to spend so much time talking about Ukraine. But on to this talk about Ukrainian genocide and how it's coming to America. There's a terrible darkness woven into the fabric of the current Ukrainian troubles. It defines the cultural divide between East and West Ukraine, and it weighs heavily on the soul of every Ukrainian. Some of you know about the great evil done to the Ukrainians by the Russians, but none of the talking heads of our mass media mention it. That darkness is the massacre of 10 million people by the Russians in 1932 and 1933 in the most horrible of ways. Starvation. Under Stalin, the Russians confiscated grain and livestock from the Ukrainians and sold it to the rest of the world. He then sent in his troops and surrounded the towns. No food was allowed in. No starving refugees were allowed out. 25,000 Ukrainian men, women, and children died every day in 1932 and 1933, and we did nothing. No, actually, we did worse. Under Holodomor Facts and History, holodomorct.org writes, quote, in fact, in November 1933, the United States, under newly elected President Franklin D. Roosevelt, chose to formally recognize Stalin's communist government and also negotiated a sweeping new trade agreement. The following year, the pattern of denial in the West culminated in the admission of the Soviet Union into the League of Nations. Stalin's 5-year plans for the modernization of the Soviet Union depended largely on the purchase of massive amounts of manufactured goods and technology from Western nations. Those nations were unwilling to disrupt lucrative trade agreements with the Soviet Union in order to pursue the matter of the famine. Close quote. We did worse than nothing. We embraced the murderer who planned and carried out these terrible crimes. Russia is going to pay a price for those 10 million innocent men, women, and children, and we, who turned our backs on them, well, we'll pay a price too, a deeply awful price. A big part of the reason for this terrible crime was the desire to subjugate the fiercely independent Ukrainians. None of the other Soviet republics were as individualistic as Ukraine, and Stalin wanted to destroy that spirit of freedom. Let me quote from the same Holodomor Facts and History that I quoted above. Quote, the Soviet government sharply increases Ukraine's production quotas, ensuring that they could not be met. Starvation becomes widespread. In the summer of 1932, a decree is implemented that calls for the arrest or execution of any person, even a child, found taking as little as a few stalks of wheat or any possible food item from the fields where he worked. By decree, discriminatory voucher systems were implemented and military blockades were erected around many Ukrainian villages, preventing the transport of food into the villages and the hungry from leaving in search of food. Brigades of young activists from other Soviet regions were brought in to sweep through the villages and confiscate hidden grain, and eventually any and all food from the farmers' homes. Stalin states of Ukraine that, quote, "The national question is in essence a rural question," close quote, and he and his commanders determined to, quote, "teach a lesson through famine," close quote, and ultimately to deal a, quote, "crushing blow," quote, close quote, to the backbone of Ukraine, its rural population, close quote. Ask yourself this question. Do you think that the New World Order globalists, aka Illuminati, are capable of doing something like this to America? I say absolutely. If there's any doubt in your mind, you need to sit up and pay attention. Go through these websites and think about substituting America every time you see the word Ukraine. The websites I list here are UkrainianGenocide.org, pay a special attention to the 75th anniversary exhibit, Holodomor 1932 to 1933, and FamineGenocide.com. There are many similarities between the U.S. and Ukraine. Ukraine was the breadbasket of Europe. The U.S. is the breadbasket of the world. Ukraine was fiercely independent. So was the U.S. To keep the USSR together, Stalin needed to break the back of Ukraine. To put the world together, the New World Order Illuminati need to break the back of the U.S. There are many, many ways that the Illuminati could replicate this genocide in the U.S. They could use an EMP attack. They could use biological weapons. They could do any number of things. But in their minds, they must do them, and are doing them right now. Because the back of America must be broken for their evil plans to succeed. God help us all. Are you ready for this? On Friday, February 28th, true evil exists, and you are the target. When I sit down to write, what appears on the screen isn't always what I intended. I didn't intend to make that personal connection to the Ukrainian genocide yesterday, and it was a bit of a surprise to me to see that connection appear in my writing. The problem is that this parallel with the Holodomor is real. It has happened before, and it will happen again, and you are the target. You must believe it. The problem is that we have a hard time truly understanding the kind of evil that would murder tens and hundreds of millions of people. We can't even grasp the possibility of this. It's too vast, it's too big, so it's just a number on a page. Concerning the Ukrainian genocide, Stalin is reported to have said, quote, "If only one man dies of hunger, that is a tragedy. If millions die, that's only statistics." Close quote. Joseph Stalin knew that he could plan the genocide of millions upon millions, and it wouldn't matter. Because after a certain point, they're just numbers on a page. We just cannot conceive of this level of evil. It's too much for us. And the truly evil understand our dilemma very, very well, and have based their success on it. When Jesus was concluding the parable of the unjust steward, he said this, quote, "For the children of this world are in their generation wiser than the children of light." Luke 16:8. A good person cannot understand true evil. There's something inside of you that cannot imagine doing what Stalin did. You're completely and utterly repulsed by it, and you don't even want to think about it. I have spent a long, long time considering the insanity of true evil, and even I struggle to believe the truth of these things. My wife can tell you that I've spent a lot of time raging at the complete insanity of the evil that is happening. How can anyone be so thoroughly vile? How is this even possible? The problem is that it's not just possible, it's being planned, and you are the target. I do not understand the conflict between God and Satan. I really don't. I don't even understand why Satan could do something so insane as to oppose God in the first place. Elie Marzulli refers to it as the cosmic chess match, and that sounds like a good name for it. Unfortunately, most of the pieces on God's side of the board don't understand the enemy. Here's Sun Tzu's comment about knowing the enemy. Quote, "If you know your enemies and know yourself, you will not be imperiled in 100 battles. If you do not know your enemies, but do know yourself, you will win one and lose one. If you do not know your enemies nor yourself, you will be imperiled in every single battle." The Art of War, Chapter 3. I know that Sun Tzu is not a prophet of God, and his rules of war are not the Bible, but his words are still true. Do you know our enemy? Do you even know yourself? The problem is that most of us do not know our enemy. We don't even know that we have an enemy, let alone having the understanding of who he is and what he's like. Worse, deep down, we don't believe God's description of how vile and evil our enemy is. Jesus said, quote, "The thief cometh not but for to steal and to kill and to destroy. I am come that they might have life, and that they might have it more abundantly." John 10:10. You must understand how implacable and evil our enemy is. His desire is to steal everything, kill everyone, and then destroy what's left. And our churches have failed in their duty to help us understand that. They have also failed in their duty to help us understand our sinfulness and show us how vulnerable we are to sin. When was the last time your pastor talked about how vulnerable to sin you are? When was the last time your pastor even mentioned the word sin? Is it any wonder that in the words of Sun Tzu, we are imperiled in every battle? So let me tell you right here, right now, that you have an enemy that wants to destroy everything you have, and your soul. He wants to corrupt every connection with God that you have. He wants to infect himself into every part of your life, and then he wants to kill you. Do you get that? The problem is I don't know that we have enough time for you to get it before Satan's plans sweep you away. You may just have to find someone who does understand what Satan is up to, and then do what he tells you to do. Don't wait to understand what's happening. There's no time for that. Just get to safety and try to figure it all out later. Remember what FDR said. Quote, "In politics, nothing happens by accident. If it happens, you can bet it was planned that way." Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Don't worry about understanding that. Just understand that a financial collapse is on its way, and it is aimed at destroying everything that you have. In my article, I have a video titled Red Alert Video, Run, Don't Walk, from the U.S. Stock Market by Greg Manarino. I seriously recommend that you pay attention to that video. But the point is, this is planned, and it is truly evil. Are you ready for this? This has been the Weekend Shockcast for March 1st and 2nd of 2014. I'm John Little for Megashock.com.